My name is Cynthia Minty. I direct the Neighborhood Initiative at AUB. It's really an honor to introduce Professors Fran Tonkus and Peter Marcuse in our closing conversation. To most of us in this room, neither needs an introduction. We know the facts about their working lives, especially their writings. But Fran's work reminds us that understanding the forces that are shaping our cities requires interdisciplinary thinking, and in her case, economic sociology and urban design. And Peter's long and distinguished career as an academic, as an activist lawyer, as an urban planner, offers us a moral compass. We need Peter more than ever to serve as our role model. He shows us how to engage with the most pressing urban problems of our time. So I'll turn over to Fran, please. Yes.
It is really a great thrill for me to be able to engage in this conversation with Peter to close the conference today. I say conversation. Last night over dinner, Peter and I scripted some aspects of our, of course, wholly spontaneous exchange, which is about to unfold. And Peter now tells me that he has a new agenda, scrawled in part on the Crown Plaza notepads, copious amounts of notes here, which consists of 25 theses, which he is going to unfurl at a very rapid rate. I will attempt to interrupt, and I may succeed in doing so. But let me begin firstly by asking Peter to start with the question of language, the conceptual categories and the empirical terms that have been circulating in the discussions over the last 2 days. We've had some discussions about Turkish translations, and Mohammed Al-Shahed yesterday reminded us very powerfully that without concepts, without a language, it becomes very difficult to identify problems and certainly to begin to imagine solutions. So Peter, let me ask you to begin by reflecting on this question of language and concepts. And you are mine.
Okay. Gladly, I want to take up the challenge that was made a little earlier by one of our organizers about changing mindsets. I don't want to change your mindset, but I would like to make us aware of the mindset that we are using as we use the language of academic discourse and political discourse around these issues. So that I want to throw out what I take to be the implications of the language that we use. And I'm not asking you to agree with me. I simply want to point out what the assumptions are that we use. It starts, we've heard this discussion before already, with the word gentrifier, who the gentrifier is. As soon as we speak of a gentrifier, we have to assign responsibility. We are already saying this is a human action that we are talking about. And whom we mean by gentrifier then becomes a critical question. And we shouldn't just use the word gentrifier without saying who we mean. The second term that we often use is natural or inevitable, that there is some natural process or processes going on that gentrification results from. And that, in a sense, is the exact opposite implication of gentrifier. The implication is, and it's unspoken, but we should be aware of it, the implication is that there's nothing we can do about it, that we have to deal with it. At best we can ameliorate or modify or alter, but we have to accept the fact that it exists. And that is an ideological assumption that will occur if we don't question the term. We ask whether it's a function of demand and supply. And if we leave it at that, we assume that demand and supply are somehow autonomous processes, that either the demand exists or it doesn't, and maybe it depends on people's psychology what the demand is. But that's an implication, and the alternative implication of demand is to say what creates the demand. And is that not a matter of human agency also? We talk about urban change as if this is something that is natural, that exists. There's nothing we can do about urban change. Of course, urban change takes place. But the implication is we can only deal with its results the way it is now. And we define implicitly, without thinking about it, we define urban change as that which is going on right now. And we ought to be aware of that assumption. There are many different kinds of urban change. And as I've argued just now, we can define what kind of change we want to have, and we may be able to deal with it or not, but we should be aware that there is human agency involved in change, and that it is not natural or inevitable. We talk, I haven't heard the word poverty used here. We use it a great deal in the United States. And we use it almost identical with the term inequality. And they are very different terms. The term poverty, just as the term displaced people, focuses on the, let me say victims, that's also a loaded term, on the victims of gentrification. And poverty focuses on those who are poor. Inequality focuses on the difference between the poor and the rich. And that's a quite different way of looking at it, and a much more controversial one. It assumes conflict. And again, we should be aware, are we talking about finding some ideal, stable state which is free of conflict, or do we recognize that on the route to dealing with changes we don't like, that there will be conflicts that have to be dealt with? The question of integration and diversity that has come up frequently. There are two ways of creating diversity, or two definitions of diversity we could have in mind, and we heard some of them today. One is diversity that is created by gentrification, which introduces higher status people into lower status neighborhoods. And the other definition of diversity is introducing lower status people into higher status neighborhoods. And that is a very different meaning of diversity, a very different result. One of them increases inequality and the other one reduces inequality. And we should be aware when we use them that one form of diversity, the form that gentrification introduces, hurts poor people, hurts the people that are already in place and being displaced, in favor of bringing in a mixture of people who were not displaced. The right to the city is a phrase we use a great deal. And we assume that it is right that we want everyone to have. The problem is that some people have it already, and others don't. And the idea that the right to the city is a common denominator, that everyone wants it, is at least an ideological assumption, which I think is contrary to reality. But in any event, we should be aware that, that when we say right to the city, we have to be clear who's right, and that it may not that rights may conflict in the right to the city. We speak of state-led, and we talked about this a good bit, Fran and I, when we were talking about this. We talk about the state as if the state were a single organic entity with a mind of its own and autonomous. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation of the state is that it is the result of political forces and economic forces and the distribution of power, and that one can't speak of, for instance, state-led gentrification without indicating who led the state to that. We talk about deregulation as a problem, that we want more regulation, as if deregulation was not a form of regulation. That is, as if deregulation were not an action, a form of limited regulation. In fact, in the gentrification area, deregulation leaves a huge amount of state regulation in place, the whole judicial system, the court system, the police, the regulation of the building industry, building codes, all remain in place, even given a lot of social deregulation. And it's a conscious decision to deregulate, not to regulate this, but instead, or to continue to regulate the other thing. We talk about creative work and the creative sector. Creative is creative has a normative implication. It's good to be creative. Well, I don't know that it's good to be creative. All creative hedge fund managers are very creative in how they manipulate the financial system. All creation isn't the same. And we should be aware when we say creative that we are including people of very different functions in society. That it's not a blanket good term that doesn't need examination. And we speak, in my last point on what we say and shouldn't, we speak about we. What can we do about these problems? Well, who is we? Who are we? We are presumably not talking about academics in as august an institution as the American University in Beirut. Who is we? With whom are we allying ourselves when we say we should do this or we need to do that? It's a term that shouldn't be used without clarification. So those are the words that I think we need to clarify when we talk. There is this whole set of words that we don't use and that make us uncomfortable when we use them. There are not as many. And, okay. There are not as many, but we should be conscious that they play a role, and maybe a significant role. One of them came up in the discussion, surprisingly, the only time I think it's come up in our discussions here, in the discussion of Palestine, the term ghettoization. It seems to me hard to talk about gentrification without talking about ghettoization. Because basically, logically, the process of gentrification concentrates some people in the area being gentrified and excludes others, displaces others from them, and what happens to them? They end up being essentially ghettoized. At least this is the American experience, unless there is unusual provision for replacement and construction of social housing and so forth. Ghettoization is in effect the reverse or the mirror image of gentrification. we should talk, it seems to me, about the concept of commodification. It's been called different things. Spatial capital, I think, is in a way another way of saying commodification. That is treating space and treating the built environment as something to be bought and sold, something to be treated for its exchange value rather than for its use value. And I think those concepts, whether you like where they come from or not, I think those are very useful differentiations that ought to be kept in mind, the difference between exchange value and use value. We talk about tenure, and we are not always clear when we talk about tenure that it means quite different things socially for different people. That tenure for poor people is a way of protecting what they have and are clinging to and is threatened. On the other hand, tenure for people that already have lots is a way of keeping what they have. And that may reinforce inequality. That is, property rights are not necessarily a radical idea. Tenure, secure tenure is not necessarily a left-wing idea. It is also a right-wing idea. Power is talked about much too little, it seems to me, in discussions of gentrification. That gentrification is, if it results from the actions of human agents, that it is the action of agents that have both wealth and social power and political power. And particularly when we ask why the government does or does not regulate this or that, we need to look at what power underlies who the state is and what the political decisions are, what the political process is. We do not talk much about classes in the classic sense of classes related to the productive process. That is, we don't talk about labor. I don't think anyone has used the term labor in the last 2 days. But in a very clear way, it seems to me that the relations within the labor market are similar to the relations within the housing market. That in both cases there are those that profit from the existing relations and those that are exploited in the existing relations, both in the labor market and in the housing market. That a great deal of profit right now, and increasingly over the last 50 years at least, has come out of profit in housing rather than the exploitation of labor. And it's the same people being exploited both ways. But in one case, they're being exploited in the process of production. In the other case, they're being exploited in the process of consumption. But the relationships between them are the same. The displacement is a term we think we understand. We don't always look at the exclusionary aspect of displacement. That is, displacement affects not only those that are there and that are being forced to move, but, affects also those that would like to be there but can't be there, that are excluded from being there. Those, because prices have gone up, some people are forced out, but other people who would be there if prices had not gone up are prevented from being there. This is why one of the basic studies in the US that a colleague of mine at Columbia has published fails to take into account that you can't only count the people that have been forced to move, but you also need to look at the count of people who would like to move who have been unable to. And that's the point, that it's the market as a whole and not only the market in gentrifying areas that needs to be looked at. So these are the points I would make about how we talk about the issues and what the controversies are. And I'd like to end with one concrete suggestion that has to do with the rent gap. And I want to make the suggestion that in implementing what we want to achieve, we ought to look at a social gap. That a social gap is, for most people, what a rent gap is for investors and property owners. That a social gap is what is important for the majority, as a rent gap is for a small minority. And that we ought to use the concept of a social gap to establish the criteria for what it is we want to implement, and use the concept of social justice as defining the way we want to close the social gap. And I think we have, the proposal has been made that we have environmental impact statements in many countries, that we ought to have social justice impact statements, social impact statements, and use that as a way of defining what kind of policies we want to implement. I'm finished.
Thank you, Peter, for that dissection. That dissection of our debates. I wanted to pick up on at least a couple of the points that you raised and which have returned throughout aspects of our city debates over the last 2 days. And in doing so, I'm particularly interested in trying to make the kinds of connections this conference was designed to do. That is, to think about how a set of analyses, a set of explanatory categories, and a body of empirical research, which originated and developed initially in the cities of the global north and west, might translate into urban contexts in the global south and east. And one of the things I've been struck by throughout the discussion, and in particular the presentations we had on gentrification processes in Beirut, was just how much these complexified the notion of state-led gentrification. I'm thinking of the panel yesterday, Marika Kreinen's paper, was it Kreenen? I'm sorry, Marika, if I'm mispronouncing it, which showed us, it sort of unpacked the idea of state-led gentrification into particular identifiable elite interests, particular kinds of family structures and corporate interlocks, but also the more impersonal role of law, of planning, of state appropriation, in other cases of public subsidy and so on. And indeed, many of the presentations from Istanbul as well put some flesh on this idea of state-led gentrification, thinking about who are the state agents, who are their cronies, and indeed, what are the state mechanisms in legal, in planning, in policy, in financing terms to enable these state-led processes. So I think that's one of the lessons that I will take back to London, where we talk often about state-led gentrification, particularly around regeneration strategies, publicly led regeneration strategies in the city, learning from Beirut and from other cities in the region. The other point I wanted to raise concerns the agents of gentrification. And this is something else which has emerged very powerfully for me from the presentations from the Middle East and North Africa in recent days. I am a sociologist, so I have to in part take the rap for a discipline which historically has perhaps over-focused on the consumption side, as it were. Tom Slater began on Wednesday evening by arguing we need to move away from the idea of the sovereign consumer in the spirit of Neil Smith, and to think more about the logics of accumulation and capital investment that are driving processes of gentrification across transnational space. And I absolutely agree with that analysis. But I've been struck in listening to the presentations from this region by the way that the gentrifying class almost disappears, is almost absent. This seems to me something quite remarkable. There is a compelling imaginary of the gentrifying classes, the people that we see drinking their coffee on their balconies or populating the pavements of the architectural renderings. But we've heard a number of stories in Beirut, in Cairo, in Palestine, of the production of housing as property and as investment capital. And if we think back to, Andrew Harris gave us a very nice definition of gentrification around the historical class that sought to derive value from land and property, but was also a sociological phenomenon. And Ruth Glass was talking about a sociological phenomenon. Whatever else those early gentrifiers in North London were doing, they were consuming housing as housing, not only and not even primarily as capital. And this is something that has come home to me very strongly in the presentations of these other gentrifications. The production and the speculation in and the investment of housing as property, absent any housing class or absent any effective residential demand that might actually populate that. So I'd want to just make a call for thinking about the sociology of gentrification from that point of view. It is almost a depopulated market process in that respect, populated by the agents of gentrification on the supply side, as it were, but not necessarily by that cast of gentrification that is so familiar from the accounts of Soho in Manhattan or Notting Hill in London, and so on. The last point I wanted to make on my side is also a sociological point, which has to do with the scales and the stages of gentrification analysis. Much of our concern in the last 2 days has been about the pre-gentrification phase, the phase of abandonment, of deterioration, of disinvestment, the widening of the rent gap, and the displacement pressures that existing residential and commercial populations live under. Or we've focused on arguments about how to prevent gentrification. And we've talked less about living with already existing gentrification, where, again, I think sociologically, not necessarily laying the blame or targeting responsibility, but thinking about different kinds of sociological relationships to gentrification is important. Ryan Sentner talked about those micro struggles over football pitches, and Javier Casanovas talked about the very pronounced spatial struggles over the use of the street and the enjoyment of a certain kind of urban amenity, including quiet at nighttime on residential streets. That this sociology of gentrification is also important for planners, designers, activists, and indeed academics to think about, and the forms of intervention, either through mobilization or through planning and design, that go to work in already existing spaces of gentrification, either to mitigate, to stem, to prevent the deepening entrenchment, but also to make some of these spaces more tolerable for the remaining communities that live there.
I'd have two quick comments on that. One is, I think the idea that gentrification is a process led by the desire to live a hippie life is long past its useful life.
No, I would totally agree. I'm
Okay.
simply saying, I'm not using this as an explanatory argument. I'm saying that we need the explanatory arguments, but we also need analyses of how people live in these urban spaces
I think
with each other.
The economic analysis of the early sociological hippie definition, I think that Neil Smith, but it's come into general use, has developed speaking of of pioneer gentrifiers, I think that has replaced the idea of a cultural desire to gentrify, that in areas that have been abandoned or run down or devalued, that it is a I don't use hippie as a derogatory term. It is the hippies that are most willing to take the risks of moving into a neighborhood that needs to be upgraded. But after a while, they get defensive also, and want to stop the process of having even higher income people moving in and displacing them, so that there's a second wave or a third wave of displacement. But the idea that displacement, that gentrification has a cultural origin is, I don't think will hold up. At least
you and I are in agreement on that.
Okay.
But it has cultural manifestations, expressions,
Yes, yes.
symbolic power. I mean, I think part of the gentrification mindset, as it were, to use Eric's term, is those identical. I'm sure I saw the same woman on the streets of Istanbul as I saw, sitting outside Ramallah, as I saw walking down the street in Cairo. She appears everywhere. This, powerful symbolic representation of what it means to live successfully in cities today.
And it may change over time. Yeah.
Shall we turn the microphone to the floor? Can I ask?
Let me make one other quick comment.
After one more quick comment.
Okay. The term upgrade, very often we identify gentrification with upgrading, and we shouldn't. You can upgrade without gentrifying, and you can gentrify without upgrading. Upgrading is changing the physical structure, and gentrification is changing the social structure. It seems to me.
Thanks so much for this very interesting conversation. I'm very appreciative of Professor Tonkas's suggestion to bring in the sociological dimension to some of the discussions that have been going on, being myself in social anthropology. In the spirit of continuing in that direction, may I suggest also that perhaps we look, and in the spirit of looking at the symbolic dimension, the word exploitation has emerged as a technical term in the planning field and architecture. Exploitation, and perhaps it needs to be be fleshed out in other terms. So when we're talking about that the figure of the woman who appears in more than one place, or living successfully, what does it mean to live successfully, and at whose expense, and at what point does that does that success turn beyond what is fair or just in terms to subsist within the city, and at what point is there a threshold beyond which people live well beyond the necessity to live? So yeah, I would invite some thought towards the idea of exploitation outside its technical usage, and more towards another symbolic, perhaps sociological ramification. Thank you.
Good evening. I have actually 3 questions. One of them is, when you talk about the social gap, there is a lot of work in social entrepreneurship on what we call social return on investment. And this is basically assessing corporate social responsibilities of company and how they contribute to the financial profitability of these companies, but also on the social impact of these companies. Can we say that this can be a tool adopted from the social entrepreneurship theory to gentrification to assess social gap? This is my first question. My second question, which is very important, I mean, throughout this 2 days, I felt there is a sense of guilt. There is a pervasive sense of guilt on what we mean by growth or economic growth or success, and all these issues. And I think this will lead to some kind of stigmatization of people who would like to improve beyond what is there. And the third one is the question of awareness and consciousness. How can we bring this question into individuals? Because most of what Mr. Marcuse's comments lie on is actually increasing consciousness and awareness on a social side. Thank you.
Actually, being a businessman and working, I have to say that the business community is uneducated, unaware, and probably there should be more communication and involvement between the business community and researchers and academia in order for us to be aware of the problems and to probably, because if we know more and become more aware, definitely we'll be more involved on a positive aspect. So I would suggest probably having more businessmen in such debates to make things better.
Yeah. In addition to what I wanted to say, I just want to do a quick reaction to what Ahmed was saying. Can we pose the question whether there can be a sort of socially acceptable kind of gentrification or morally acceptable? Can we reach this by any means at one point of time, although it is moving by the drive for the market force of the market forces? So this is a question. But I wanted to contribute to the conclusions of the conference by having two suggestions. The first is that I think what I am going back inspired with is the need to explore the overlaps between gentrification and very related other fields, including, for example, informal housing, which I have actually worked a lot on. Also, urban legislation and urban policies. There are a great degree. I'm teaching urban policy. I know gentrification, but the more we got into this conference, into gentrification issues, I see that it needs to be more reflected in urban policies and also urban legislation, especially in the Arab region now. There are constitutional and legislative reforms following the political changes, so there is an opportunity there. Also urban management, and we talked about failing cities in terms of delivering to the expectations of their citizens, so where gentrification is related to this. One last issue is also mobility, and it's housing mobility, but also the whole notion of the attachment to place. Whether this is something that is actually, this is what gentrification is against, that people can move from one place to the other if the full mobility options are there. So is it something good or bad? Do people accept it or not accept it? I think this needs to be well researched. And that pushed me to the last point, which is about the need to study people's choices. I suggest people's choices to be an indicator of urban development or urban transformation. What is the amount of choices in everything, in urban mobility and housing and everything? What choices are available to each social group or socioeconomic group is something that we need to reflect on as a sort of an indicator of urban development. Thank you.
I'm going to try to respond to a few of the points that are raised in one compound answer. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to come back to the question of economic growth and socially acceptable gentrification, if you will. I am certainly in favor of economic growth. Not everybody in this room, I'm sure, is. I mean, I'm doubtless there are people here who would question economic growth as an objective of urban policy. But this is something that I would favor, particularly when we think about economic growth in terms of growing employment. One of the main reasons people come to live in cities is because of economic opportunities. Everyone, you know, I'm an economic migrant to one of the largest cities in the world. Well, not one of the largest urban economies in the world, I should say. It's not just speculative investors who are drawn to economic opportunity in the city. We seek opportunities for employment, for creative forms of labor, and I mean that in the fullest sense, not in the Richard Florida sense, and so on. But the question is how the benefits of that economic growth are distributed. It comes back to the point about exploitation. So economic growth, to my mind, I know I will get an argument from some quarters, is good for cities, but it's not good when it is so maldistributed in terms of who gains the benefits and who derives the profits from that growth. And that is a problem for governments and for societies in terms of what they will deem acceptable, legitimate, and appropriate. One of the questions that was asked in the last panel is whether it's possible to have urban change without gentrification, and I think it probably isn't where property markets are in operation. However, again, where gentrification is the dominant model of urban development, as it is in so many cities, it is in my city, it is in this city, it is in many of the other cities we've discussed, then that is highly problematic, where there are no policy and development alternatives to a very orthodox model of gentrification, then that is definitely problematic. And two last points. One has to do with the role of government in systems of pre-distribution in the city, not just redistributing goods and services, but actually setting the rules of the game around rents, around planning law, around property title, and so on. The pre-distributive measures that states take that determines the outcomes of economic growth in part and how they're distributed. And the last minor point on the social return on investment question, I think this would be a good tool for thinking about how we measure and seek to measure the social gap and think about how different development programs would seek to close it. My concern is that the social return on investment is a necessary tool for speaking to an economic understanding of development. You have to put dollar signs on social values. And so there is a good reason for doing that if you want to challenge and contest initiatives which are wholly phrased in terms of returns on investment. But I think it's a tactic. I'm not sure it is necessarily politics in its own right. It's a way of fighting commodified fire with a different form of value. But it does depend on, as I say, capitalizing social values, which politically I would not otherwise want to do.
Sorry, I don't disagree with any of that. But a couple of... The question of whether you can have good gentrification, I think, is it's a contradiction in terms. The definition of gentrification, I think, that we generally use is that it is the displacement of people of lower income or lower status by people of higher income or higher status. And by definition, that's bad. That does not mean that there is no way of upgrading the physical structure of a community. There is no way of improving the lives of people in a community. Certainly there is. You can have social housing, you can increase wages, you can have slum upgrading. There are lots of ways of improving life in cities other than gentrification. But gentrification, as long as we want to use the term, I think includes the displacement end. And there is a marginal question of whether if you had displacement but provided better alternative housing to those that are displaced, is that still gentrification or not? But that happens so little that I don't think it's a major subject. The question of choice, and I think in the discussion it's already come out this way, the choice is constrained by what the alternatives are. And I resist the idea that gentrification comes about because people have changed. Suddenly they'd rather play guitars than soccer or something like that. It seems to me people's choices change when they have other opportunities that they didn't have before. So that it's in that sense not a matter of people changing, but of the constraints that they work under. And the final point, the role of education and mobility options and wages above almost anything else is, it seems to me, critical in the discussion of gentrification. I think you could have all of the benefits of upgrading if you just doubled people's incomes at the bottom end of the scale. That's not likely to happen very quickly, but it seems to me very important to realize that it has something to do with what happens in the labor market and how much income people have. And that it might be one way of approaching the problem of displacement by looking at it from a labor market end rather than a housing market end.
I would like to thank this invitation and the opportunity to listen to very, very interesting works on gentrification in this area, especially those that I most enjoyed about Beirut, of course Turkey, and also Palestine, which was a tremendous surprise to just grasp a little bit of what is going on there in terms of the gentrification and the ghettoization of land. So many thanks. But also I enjoyed very much hearing the other side that was brought here, and I think that revealed some kind of dialectical intelligence of bringing those bad guys, which I really learned from, especially the real estate topic in Egypt. And I'm seriously speaking that I usually do that in my case studies in Latin America, that I enjoy and learn from interviewing real estate developers, because that reveals something that Peter Marcuse has said 15 minutes ago. I mean, he said that yesterday too. I mean, this is not, gentrification is not something that is naturally happening. Nothing happens naturally in cities. I mean, cities are human constructions. But also gentrification is, if Frank Tonkis is asking, where are the agents? Well, that's precisely where are the agents of gentrification. People who take decisions every day, not to make just profit, as we learn today, but also they have their beliefs in doing the good for cities, which I don't agree, that's good. I think it's a good for the few and the bad for the many. But I think they have their position and they take their own decisions. So gentrification is a conflict of many decisions being taken with so different levels of power deployed in space. But I learned so much in these 3 days of conference. And I wonder, the more I read about gentrification and the more I hear people reflecting on gentrification, the more I'm convinced that gentrification might be a grand theory, or becoming more and more a grand theory, and not a mid-range theory as some authors recently have been claiming. And since gentrification is increasingly being a grand theory, that means that it has a sort of generic nature, as Eric Clark has recently said, that is very productive because it gives us the opportunity to reflect on the specificities of every context without losing the generic aspects of gentrification. And in my views, that generic aspect of gentrification can be summarized in 2 axes. Of course, dialectical axes. The first one is the axis of class confrontation, which is very productive to bring to the analysis. Especially in contexts like this one, where class conflict has been somehow hidden by other agendas and other conflicts, other type of confrontations, like the religious ones, or I don't know, other types of confrontation. And the second axis is, as Frank Tonkis has recently said, the dialectical confrontation between growth and distribution. So those two things for me are part of the grand theory nature of gentrification, which reveals that it's more and more becoming a grand theory. So many thanks for inviting me here. I have really enjoyed this conference.
Can we take one question next to Ernesto and then a last one here in front?
Actually, I'm not going to repeat what you said. I've learned also immensely, but there are just a few things I wanted to bring to the table.
Quickly.
Yes, very, very quickly. One is the role of the designer, what we as designer can do, or should we do, or should we not do in the face of gentrification. And what I've seen during those 2 days is that the designer or the academic is playing a role of an activist, and sometimes as a mediator between different classes or between the developer and the locals and so forth. And I think that this is a new role, and also in the design schools, that's a new trend to teach our students to go beyond the realm of design of architecture. This is the first thing. The second thing is that is a point that Mona brought in her keynote lecture yesterday, is maybe should we accept the fact that cities live through cycles, that gentrification would happen and de-gentrification would follow and so forth, and therefore should we as designers, I can just speak from my own perspective, offer typologies that are resilient and flexible, that could accept those changes rather than fighting against them. And I think that the case of Fez, in a very odd matter, which is a World Heritage City, and it's a heritage city, so we think it's not static, that it's static, but actually for 12 centuries it has been regenerating itself, gentrifying, de-gentrifying, and so forth, yet it kept its character. And why? It's very simply because its typology, which is the courtyard house and its urban structure, are functioning so well that they're able to absorb and deabsorb those forces of gentrification. So maybe this is a question that us architects and designers could think about a resilient form of architecture.
Great, thank you.
I also want to thank you for an amazing 3 days. And actually what I wanted to say relates to what Aziza was saying, in the sense that I felt that there is, as much as we heard a lot about sort of the gentrifier and the state and grand theories and global politics and national politics, etc., it seems to me that the person on the other end, on the receiving end of this process, the community that exists has not been discussed enough, has not been represented enough. It seems to me that when it's represented, it's almost as if there's passive recipients, or they're forced to become activists. But these processes happen in a place that already has its own set of interests, its own set of processes, its own set of resources. And I believe that in ignoring them, we're actually ignoring a potential tool in terms of tapping into these resources and tapping into these interests and incorporating in the process of upgrading or improvement tools and tactics that would allow these people to build on these existing processes and interests to fight the gentrification or to fight displacement.
I'm going to close by giving a very unsatisfactory answer to Aziz's question, actually. I think it won't satisfy you. Well, an anecdote and an answer. One of my students, I work with designers and social scientists, architects, planners, lawyers, together in the graduate program on which I teach. And our concern is to instill in them the notion that they are all engaged in the design of the city in various ways, especially the lawyers, especially the economists, and so on. So the specialist designer is not necessarily, and in fact is quite rarely, the person who really has the power to make decisions over how space is made in the city. One of my students said to me in a moment of frustration, I don't want to spend my career making pocket parks. You know, he could, as if this was the only sort of highest kind of space you could make, small public realm interventions that were non-exclusionary. The only way he could do no harm as a designer was to do something that he saw as ultimately fairly decorative. It was a harsh criticism on his part. And I responded to him by saying, well, better a pocket park than a prison. And he said, no, actually, I think it's more important to design good prisons than it is to design good pocket parks, which gave me pause. I think he won that exchange. So my unsatisfactory answer would be to recognize the limited power that designers have. Designers, of course, always have the power to say no, but having said yes, they are working in a highly constrained setting, and otherwise to expand our understanding of who is engaged in the design of space and the design of cities, and not blame the architects, but to think about all those other designs on space that are often more effective and certainly more powerful.
Quickly on the variety of good questions. Some things do happen naturally. I'm aware of one of them. When one gets older, that's a fairly natural. But I resist very much the idea that there is no alternative to gentrification because it's a natural process. I think there are lots of alternatives to gentrification that are better than it, and we know what they are. None of them are easy to do, but that's not for lack of knowledge, really. We know how to build decent cities, how to build decent housing, how to bring costs down, how to raise wages. These are not mysteries. So that I think there is an alternative to gentrification. We're not looking simply for a solution to the problem that ameliorates the disadvantages of gentrification. We're looking for another approach to upgrading and improving the quality of life and the quality of the built environment. The question of what designers can do, I teach in a school of architecture and planning also, and there is one simple rule that I use and try to impress on my colleagues, but they don't like it. Precisely for this, I don't want to spend my life doing pocket parks. The question of who you design for. Because the people that are nicest to design for, the people that have the most money and will pay you the most. And if that's the rule that you want to follow for what you want to do with your life, then go ahead and design for the gentry. If you have other principles, then you ought to keep them in mind, serve them, and they start with the question of whom are you serving? Are you serving those who, in all justice and fairness, need it or not? Well, the last thing I think I want to say is about the conference itself. It seems to me that it's been an extraordinarily provocative and productive conference, at least for me. I knew very little about what many of the presentations have provided. I've learned a great deal from being here, and I appreciate very much the opportunity of having been here. And I think maybe what we've done is provided the agenda for the next 3 or 4 conferences. And if they succeed in moving forward, we'll have done something good.
Great. Well, I think we should just thank our eminent guest.